In the quiet suburban town of Evanston, Illinois, Laura Sanders lived what appeared to be a flawless life. To neighbors and friends, she was the embodiment of the ideal wife and mother, her days filled with playdates, school pickups, and family gatherings. Her home, nestled in a friendly neighborhood where children's laughter filled the air, seemed to reflect the picture-perfect stability and love she had devoted herself to creating. With her husband, David, a successful and charming man, and two beautiful children, Lily and Ethan, Laura's life was one anyone would envy. But behind the polished windows and neatly kept lawns, something was beginning to unravel. Laura had always prided herself on the life she and David had built, a life that had seemed almost destined when they first met. They had come together in the way young lovers do, driven by dreams of family, warmth, and stability. David had promised her a future of loyalty and joy, and Laura had been more than willing to pour herself into that dream, putting her career ambitions on hold to be a full-time mother and homemaker. Her days were spent raising their children and building a home that would be a safe haven for all of them. But one winter evening in early 2013, Laura felt a shadow cross the sunny facade of her life. She had noticed David coming home later than usual, giving vague excuses about meetings running over. The warmth in his eyes seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a distant coldness that she couldn't ignore. When he did speak to her, his words were brief, as though she were an afterthought. And then there was the smell, a faint, flowery scent that lingered on his clothes, one that didn't belong to Laura. She convinced herself it was her imagination, the stress of caring for a household creeping into her mind. After all, she reasoned, David had never given her a reason to doubt him. Still, her instincts wouldn't rest. Small details began to pile up, details that didn't quite make sense. David's phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now his constant companion. He guarded it like a secret, slipping it into his pocket whenever she entered the room. And their bed, once a place of warmth and whispered words, had turned cold. He slept facing away from her, his body distant, his mind clearly elsewhere. It wasn't until one cold January morning that Laura's fears finally broke through her denial. As she sorted through the Daily Mail, her fingers froze on an unfamiliar envelope. It was a bank statement, with a recent charge that caught her eye. There, printed in black ink, was a transaction at a hotel she didn't recognize, a place with no business for David to be. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the dates. There wasn't just one charge, but several. Each one marked a betrayal that left her feeling like the floor beneath her was crumbling away. She took a breath, clutching the statement with trembling hands, her mind swirling with questions. She knew she needed more proof, more than just a suspicious charge on a credit card. But this was the crack in the facade, and Laura couldn't look away anymore. This wasn't just her imagination. It was something real, something ugly lurking beneath the surface of her perfect life. And with every passing day, her need to uncover the truth grew stronger, like a flame consuming her from within. Laura's mind couldn't shake the memories of how she and David had met, how utterly perfect it had all seemed. They were fresh out of college, full of ambition, and David had been the kind of man who could light up a room. His confidence had swept her off her feet, a stark contrast to the shy but steady resolve she carried. David had promised her a life of adventure and endless love, and Laura, with her heart wide open, had believed him. She had believed him so thoroughly that she hadn't hesitated when he proposed starting a family, encouraging her to leave her career behind so that they could raise their children in the kind of home they'd always dreamed of. In the early days, it seemed they had it all. They bought a cozy house in Evanston, with a yard for the kids and neighbors who became friends. Laura had watched David leave for work each morning with a kiss and a promise, her heart warmed by the life they had built together. She had embraced motherhood with joy, pouring all of her energy into raising Lily and Ethan. David was their provider, working long hours but returning home with smiles and stories, filling the air with laughter. For years, Laura thought they had crafted a bond that was unbreakable. Her love for him was deep and unwavering, and she believed that their connection could withstand anything. But things began to change. By late 2012, she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in David's behavior. He seemed distant, distracted by things she couldn't see or understand. Their shared laughs became rare, replaced by strained conversations that barely skimmed the surface of their lives. She tried to tell herself that every marriage had its rough patches. And yet, the tension grew. He became protective of his phone, clinging to it as if it held a secret he couldn't bear to share. Sometimes, late at night, Laura would wake to see him turned away from her, his face bathed in the dim glow of his screen, texting someone who wasn't her. The intimacy between them had faded like a distant memory, and Laura began to feel like a stranger in her own marriage. She searched her mind for explanations, wondering if maybe she was at fault, that somehow, in focusing on the kids and the house, she had lost her connection to David. But that idea twisted something inside her. She had given up so much for this family, had sacrificed her own ambitions and dreams to build a life with him. What more could he possibly want? One night, unable to sleep, she watched as David slipped his phone under his pillow, his movements quick, almost nervous. That small act hit her like a revelation. It was more than a quirk or an innocent habit, it was a wall he was building, a barrier that shut her out. The seed of doubt grew into something darker, heavier, until she could no longer ignore it. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers. But she knew he would find a way to dismiss her, to twist her words until she doubted her own mind. Then, January arrived with a harsh, unforgiving cold that seeped into the walls of their home. It was on one of those bleak mornings, as she was sorting through the bills and mail, that her suspicions gained solid ground. In her hand was a credit card statement, the one with the charges from a hotel across town, a place with no reason to be in their lives. Her fingers shook as she scanned the list, seeing not one but several visits, each marking a betrayal she hadn't imagined. The dates aligned with nights David had claimed he was working late, nights she had sat alone, telling herself he was doing it all for their family. Her heart raced as she pieced together the fragments of lies and inconsistencies. The signs she dismissed as stress or routine were, in fact, the breadcrumbs of deceit. She felt a swell of anger and pain that threatened to consume her. She wanted to storm into his office, confront him right then and there. But she stopped herself, realizing that a confrontation without proof could give him the chance to deny, to make her look like the unreasonable one. That night, as David slept beside her, Laura lay wide awake, a fierce resolve settling in her chest. She wouldn't be placated or dismissed, she needed to know the full truth, even if it meant shattering the life she had so carefully constructed. She would wait, she would gather evidence, and when the time was right, she would make sure he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. For the first time in their marriage, Laura felt the cold weight of distrust, and there was no turning back. Laura's discovery of the hotel charges left her shaken, but her resolve grew fiercer with each passing day. She no longer felt like the gentle, forgiving wife who had once believed in the strength of her marriage. Now, she was someone else entirely, a woman betrayed, a woman who needed answers, even if they tore apart everything she'd known. She knew that confronting David with just the credit card bill would do little, he'd find a way to twist her words, turn the blame back on her, and convince her she was seeing things that weren't there. No, she needed more. She needed undeniable proof. That night, she stayed up, her mind racing with plans. Her hands clenched and unclenched as she weighed each possibility. David's guarded behavior had made her cautious, but she was determined to find a way around his defenses. She began searching for any opportunity to look through his phone, knowing it held the secrets he tried so desperately to hide. And finally, one night, after he drifted into a deep sleep, she seized her chance. With careful, steady hands, she unlocked his phone, every second feeling like an eternity as she scrolled through his messages. And there, buried among his emails and work conversations, she found them, messages to a woman named Emma. The exchanges were intimate, casual, as if they'd been talking for months. Her breath caught as she read their flirtations, their plans to meet, the casual promises that were once meant only for her. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The man she had loved for years had betrayed her in ways she couldn't even comprehend. But still, she did not confront him. Laura knew she couldn't go into this fight half prepared. She needed more than words on a screen, she needed evidence that David could never explain away. Over the next few weeks, she turned her home into a quiet battleground. She watched him closely, memorizing his patterns, noting every suspicious move. Her days became an act of silent surveillance as she pieced together the evidence, knowing it would all be worth it in the end. On a chilly February evening, she made a decision. She ordered 2 small, inconspicuous cameras online, ones that could be hidden in plain sight without drawing suspicion. When the packages arrived, she took them up to their bedroom under the pretense of tidying up. One camera was hidden within a decorative clock on the dresser, angled to capture every move within their bedroom. Another was placed in the living room, tucked into a photo frame, catching the entire view of the room. Laura worked methodically, positioning each device with care, ensuring they were invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. Each step felt surreal, like she was watching herself from the outside, but she pushed forward. But her preparations didn't end there. She needed to capture his words, too. One evening, after David left his briefcase unattended, she discreetly placed a voice recorder inside, a small device that would activate at the sound of his voice. Every phone call, every whispered promise he made to Emma would now be recorded, saved, and preserved as irrefutable evidence. She felt a twisted satisfaction as she completed her setup, knowing he was living in a house that would betray him just as he had betrayed her. In the days that followed, Laura distanced herself emotionally from David. She stopped trying to talk to him, stopped asking where he'd been or why he'd come home so late. She played her part perfectly, giving him space to carry on his affair without interruption. He began to relax, his arrogance growing with each passing day. David believed her silence meant she had accepted the unspoken distance between them, that she was too preoccupied with the children and their daily lives to notice his indiscretions. He was wrong. As the cameras recorded their lives and the voice recorder captured his secrets, Laura found herself growing stronger. Every piece of evidence added to her arsenal, fueling the fire that had ignited within her. She watched as David brought Emma into their home when he thought she was out running errands, oblivious to the silent witness that recorded every stolen touch, every lingering glance. Her marriage, once a source of comfort and pride, had turned into a cold, calculated trap that David walked into day after day. By the end of February, Laura had gathered everything she needed, hours of footage, dozens of recordings, and enough text messages to shatter any facade David might try to uphold. But she wasn't done. She had a plan, a public reckoning that would leave him nowhere to hide. Laura was no longer the wife who waited in silence, she was the woman who would see justice done, even if it meant tearing down the very foundation of the life they had built together. By the time February came to a close, Laura had gathered all the proof she needed. The evidence was irrefutable, videos of David and Emma together in their home, audio recordings of whispered conversations, and text messages saved and catalogued in her mind. But she couldn't let it sit any longer. Each night, as she lay beside him, the betrayal festered like an open wound, growing more unbearable with each passing day. She could no longer keep up the facade, couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine. It was time to confront him. She chose a quiet night, one where the children were already asleep, and the house lay still under the weight of her pent-up anger. David sat in the living room, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. Laura could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she approached him, her hands clenched tight to stop them from shaking. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind, imagining every word she would say and how he might respond. But now, standing there, words felt inadequate to express the depth of her betrayal. "David," she began, her voice low and steady, "we need to talk." He looked up, surprised by the tone of her voice, but quickly hid his surprise with a practiced smile. "What's going on?" he asked casually, as if this were any ordinary conversation. But Laura could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a subtle shift as he sensed the gravity of what was to come. Without another word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, scrolling to the saved text messages she'd taken from his phone and holding it out to him. His face drained of color as he read the familiar words, his expression turning from confusion to panic. For a moment, he looked up, opening his mouth as if to say something, but Laura wasn't finished. She moved to the table and set down a USB drive containing the videos, her eyes fixed on him as she spoke. "Don't even try to lie," she said, her voice firmer than she'd thought possible. "I know everything. I've seen everything. You think I didn't notice? You think I was too busy to see what was happening right in front of me?" David's eyes darted back and forth as he searched for a response, his mind racing for some way out. "Laura, you're overreacting. It's not what you think." His voice was calm, but Laura could hear the tremor of desperation underneath. "I've been under a lot of stress with work, Anne." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice like steel. "Don't insult me by pretending this is about work. This isn't a mistake, David. This is a choice you made, repeatedly. While I was here with our kids, holding this family together, you were sneaking around, bringing her into our home. Into our children's lives." For a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of shame cross his face, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by a defensive glare. "You don't understand," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "You've been so focused on the kids, on the house, on everything else. There hasn't been anything left for us. I was lonely, Laura." "Lonely?" she echoed, her voice rising. She felt a wave of anger so intense she had to clench her fists to keep from screaming. "I gave up everything for you, for this family. I put my own life on hold so you could build your career, so you could have the life you wanted. And now you're going to stand there and blame me for your choices?" David's defenses began to crumble, his eyes darting around the room as he tried to think of something, anything that might defuse the situation. But he was trapped, cornered by the weight of his own lies. For the first time, he realized that Laura wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to let him smooth this over with empty promises or vague apologies. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged, until he finally spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Laura. I never wanted to hurt you." Laura stared at him, feeling the cold emptiness of his words sink in. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was something left worth saving. But the images of him with Emma, the sound of his whispered promises, played over and over in her mind. The man she had trusted, the man she had sacrificed so much for, was gone, replaced by a stranger who couldn't even admit his guilt without trying to shift the blame. "No," she said quietly, a finality in her voice. "You're not sorry. If you were, you would have stopped. But you didn't, did you? You kept going, thinking I'd never find out, that I'd be too blinded by love to see the truth." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him in the silence he had created. Laura felt a grim satisfaction as she went upstairs, knowing that he would spend the rest of the night alone with nothing but his shame. She had confronted him, but this was only the beginning. There was still more to be done, and when she was ready, David would face a reckoning that he would never forget. Laura's confrontation with David did little to soothe the storm raging within her. He hadn't shown remorse, he hadn't begged for forgiveness, nor had he even attempted to repair the damage he'd caused. Instead, he'd only grown colder, more defensive, like a man who'd lost all sense of responsibility and respect. Each day, as she watched him move through their home with a quiet, simmering defiance, Laura felt the last threads of her patience unravel. But it was a single moment, a single slip, that tore away any remaining hope she had for their marriage. One Saturday afternoon, as she returned from a grocery run, Laura was greeted by her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, who was buzzing with innocent curiosity. "Mommy," she began, clutching a teddy bear as she looked up at Laura with wide, questioning eyes. "Who was the lady Daddy had here today?" Laura's heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She knelt down, trying to keep her expression calm even as her mind raced. "What lady, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle but tense. Lily tilted her head, a small frown forming on her lips as she tried to explain. "She was sitting really close to Daddy," she said. "They were hugging, like you and Daddy used to do." Laura's chest tightened as the truth sank in. David had crossed a line that she could never forgive. He hadn't just betrayed her, he'd brought his betrayal into their home, into the lives of their children. In that moment, she knew that whatever hope she'd clung to for saving her marriage was gone. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore, it was about protecting her children from a man who'd shattered the sanctity of their family without a second thought. That night, as David went to bed, oblivious to the tidal wave building within her, Laura lay awake, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a lead blanket. She knew what she had to do. There would be no quiet divorce, no silent suffering as he walked away unscathed. No, David would face the consequences of his actions in front of the people who mattered most to him. As the days passed, Laura began laying out her plan with quiet, meticulous determination. The annual Sanders family reunion was fast approaching, scheduled for July 4th at David's parents' estate just outside Evanston. It was an event David looked forward to each year, a day of barbecues, family games, and a traditional family slideshow that celebrated their shared history. This year, though, the reunion would be remembered for something far different. She purchased a small, discreet USB drive and loaded it with a carefully edited compilation of the damning footage and audio recordings she'd gathered over the months. Laura reviewed each clip, ensuring it captured the undeniable truth of David's infidelity, moments of intimacy with Emma in their own home, his voice laced with the softness he no longer shared with her. The images and sounds burned into her memory, yet there was a sense of clarity that came with her task. For the first time, she felt calm, her anger tempered by a resolve that had hardened into steel. On the morning of July 4th, Laura dressed in simple, understated clothing, careful not to betray the storm brewing within her. As she and David drove to his parents' estate with Lily and Ethan in the back seat, she maintained a quiet, neutral expression, her mind focused on the task at hand. David, oblivious as ever, chatted about the barbecue, about catching up with his siblings and cousins, all while Laura listened with the eerie calm of someone who had already made up her mind. The reunion was as lively as it always was, with David's family gathering in the backyard, laughing and sharing stories while the children ran around, their laughter echoing through the sprawling lawn. Laura played her part, smiling when required, nodding along to conversations, all the while clutching her purse tightly, the USB hidden safely within it. As dusk settled, David's father announced that it was time for the family slideshow, a cherished tradition that marked each reunion with photos of weddings, birthdays, and holidays gone by. Everyone gathered in the living room, settling into chairs and couches, their attention drawn to the screen at the front of the room. Laura moved quietly to the laptop connected to the projector, waiting until the room was dark and the first images began to play. In the low light, no one noticed as she slipped the USB into the port, her heart steady as she navigated to her carefully curated file. With a deep breath, she pressed play, stepping back to watch the scene unfold. At first, the room was filled with confusion as unfamiliar images flickered onto the screen. Instead of family memories, there was David, unmistakably captured in moments of intimacy with Emma, his laughter and whispered promises filling the silent room. The room went still, and then, one by one, gasps echoed through the crowd. Faces turned toward David, expressions shifting from confusion to shock, to disgust. Laura saw his mother cover her mouth, his father's face turn ashen as the truth played out before them. David froze, his face pale, his body rigid as he realized what was happening. He tried to stand, but Laura was there, blocking his path, her eyes cold and unyielding. She didn't say a word, but her presence alone held him back, forcing him to face the family he had so proudly paraded his perfect life in front of. As the slideshow continued, Laura felt a sense of release, a quiet satisfaction that washed over her as the truth finally shattered the facade he'd built. She had given him every chance, every opportunity to change, to confess, but he had thrown it all away. Now, in front of the family he had so deeply respected, he would face the consequences of his choices, with nowhere to hide. As the final moments of the video played, an oppressive silence blanketed the room. Laura felt the weight of each passing second as the images of David and Emma disappeared from the screen, leaving only a black void that matched the hollow ache in her chest. Around her, David's family sat frozen, struggling to process the scene they'd just witnessed. Their once lively faces were now etched with shock, disbelief, and anger, the air thick with betrayal. David stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the empty screen as if refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. His skin had turned an ashen gray, his jaw clenched tight as he swallowed the reality of his exposed infidelity. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer some desperate justification, but the words died before they could escape, caught in the tightening grip of his own shame. Laura could feel his family's eyes shift toward him, the silent weight of their judgment pressing down on him from every direction. His mother looked devastated, her hand trembling as she clutched the edge of her chair. His father, a stern man known for his unwavering pride, looked away, unable to meet his son's gaze. His siblings exchanged glances, their eyes brimming with a mix of sympathy for Laura and disgust for David. The illusion of his perfect family life had been shattered in one brutal moment, and there was no going back. David's eldest brother, James, was the first to break the silence. "David," he said, his voice rough with disappointment, "how could you?" The words hung heavily in the air, as if they were an indictment, a question that demanded answers but knew none would be sufficient. But David couldn't meet his brother's eyes. His gaze flickered to Laura, and for a brief moment, she saw something that almost looked like remorse, a flicker of regret in his eyes. But she knew better. If he'd truly been sorry, he would have confessed long ago. He wouldn't have continued lying, sneaking around, and dragging their children into his deceit. Whatever regret he felt now was only the consequence of being caught. "Laura," he began, his voice strained, but she held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't," she said firmly, her tone steely, unwavering. "I've listened to enough lies. This is not the time for more excuses." She reached into her bag and, with the same calm precision that had carried her through these last few months, pulled out a neatly prepared envelope. Inside were the divorce papers she'd filed weeks before the reunion, a step she'd known was inevitable once she'd seen the truth with her own eyes. With a quiet determination, she tossed the envelope at his feet, her eyes locked onto his. "These are my terms, David," she said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Full custody of Lily and Ethan. Half of everything we built together. There will be no negotiation, no compromise. You will sign these papers, and you will honor every word." The words left her lips with a power she hadn't felt in years. She watched as David's expression shifted from shock to anger, a raw, desperate fury that tightened his features. But he didn't move, didn't dare challenge her. He knew, as did everyone in the room, that he had no defense left. The silence returned, heavier than before, until his father finally spoke, his voice low and firm. "David, you have disgraced this family," he said, his voice filled with a sorrow that went beyond anger. "Whatever happens next, you've brought it upon yourself." The quiet resolve in his tone left no room for argument, no hint of forgiveness. Unable to bear the weight of his family's condemnation, David turned and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the silence. Laura didn't watch him go, her focus was on the faces of the people who had once embraced her as part of their family. She could see the sympathy in their eyes, the silent apologies they offered her for the betrayal they, too, had endured. She felt a wave of unexpected relief, a sense that, perhaps, she hadn't lost everything after all. After a long, silent moment, David's mother reached for Laura's hand, squeezing it gently, her eyes filled with unspoken sorrow. "We didn't know, Laura," she whispered, her voice breaking. We trusted him. We trusted he would take care of you. Laura nodded, her own eyes softening. I know, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. I did, too. But it's over now. It's time to move forward. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet, strained hush. The family, still reeling from the shock, gathered around Laura, offering her words of comfort and support. She accepted each one with gratitude, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. David's siblings promised to stand by her, to help her and the children in any way they could, a show of loyalty that left her feeling both strengthened and validated. In their eyes, she saw a promise of solidarity, a reassurance that she wasn't alone. As the night wore on, Laura felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For months, she had carried the burden of David's betrayal, hidden behind forced smiles and quiet endurance. But now, standing in the aftermath of his exposure, she felt lighter. She was no longer bound by the secrets he'd forced her to carry. She was free. When the reunion finally drew to a close, she gathered her children and prepared to leave, her steps lighter than they'd been in a long time. As they drove away from the estate, Laura looked back only once, catching a final glimpse of the life she was leaving behind. She didn't feel regret or sadness. She felt something far more powerful, a sense of peace, of resolution, of strength. With Lily and Ethan safely buckled in the back seat, Laura looked forward, her gaze steady and clear. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she was ready. For the first time, she was stepping into a future that was entirely her own, free from lies, free from betrayal, and ready to rebuild a life of her choosing. In the days that followed the reunion, the reality of David's betrayal reverberated throughout Evanston. News of the scandal spread quickly among their friends, neighbors, and extended family. Whispers of David's indiscretions, once hidden behind a carefully constructed image, were now public knowledge, casting a shadow over the life he tried so hard to present as perfect. Laura felt the shift almost immediately. People she once thought of as casual acquaintances reached out with words of encouragement, small gestures of kindness that reminded her she wasn't alone. Laura, too, felt a shift within herself. For so long, she had measured her worth by her role as a wife and mother, by the stability of her marriage and the sacrifices she had made. But now, without David's presence, she began to reclaim parts of herself that had long been buried. She found moments of joy in small, unexpected places, in morning walks with Lily and Ethan, in coffee with friends who'd come to support her, and in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life she was rebuilding from the ground up. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly, aided by the undeniable evidence Laura had gathered. David, his reputation in shambles and his pride wounded, could hardly mount a defense. The judge reviewed the mountain of evidence Laura had provided, the hours of footage and audio recordings that painted a vivid picture of David's betrayal. His attempts to argue for shared custody fell flat in the face of Laura's meticulous documentation, and within weeks, the court granted her full custody of Lily and Ethan. David was ordered to pay monthly child support and to divide their assets equally. For David, the punishment was severe, but it was nothing compared to the loss he felt in his own family. His parents, once his staunchest supporters, could barely look at him. His father's face remained impassive through each hearing, but his silence spoke volumes, a constant reminder of the shame David had brought upon their family. His mother, once warm and doting, had turned cold, unable to reconcile the man she had raised with the man exposed at the reunion. David's siblings, too, kept their distance, their loyalty shifting toward Laura and the children she was raising without him. The life he had known, the respect, the admiration, the family that had once surrounded him, had been replaced by isolation and silence. For Laura, each hearing brought a sense of closure, a gradual relief that allowed her to move forward without looking back. The weight she'd carried for months had lifted, leaving her free to focus on the future she was creating for herself and her children. The betrayal, while still painful, no longer defined her. She had faced it, confronted it, and walked away with her head held high. With the divorce finalized, Laura embraced her new life with an open heart. She enrolled in a part-time course at the local college, reigniting her passion for education that she had once set aside to raise her family. Each class was a step toward a career she had put on hold, and with every lecture, every assignment, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her days became filled with learning, growth, and moments of discovery that reminded her of the person she had been before her life had become so tightly bound to David's dreams. Lily and Ethan, too, seemed to blossom in the new environment Laura created. Free from the tension that had once filled their home, they grew closer to their mother, finding comfort in the routines she built for them. Weekends became a time for adventure, with trips to the park, movie nights, and quiet evenings reading together. Laura saw the sparkle return to their eyes, and she felt a warmth that went beyond the pain she had endured. She was giving them a life built on truth, on stability, on love that was honest and unwavering. As the weeks turned into months, the scars of the past began to fade, replaced by a resilience that defined Laura's every action. Her neighbors, friends, and family admired her strength, her ability to rise from the ashes of betrayal and forge a new path. She became a quiet inspiration, a testament to the power of standing up for oneself, of refusing to be a silent victim. People admired her courage and her dignity, and she felt the silent support of her community in each nod of acknowledgement, each smile of encouragement she encountered. But it wasn't just about survival for Laura, it was about finding joy again, about rediscovering herself beyond the roles she had been given. She took up yoga, joined a book club, and spent time nurturing friendships she had neglected for years. She allowed herself to laugh, to dream, to think about a future where happiness was possible, one that she defined on her own terms. One evening, as she tucked Lily and Ethan into bed, they each hugged her tightly, their small arms wrapping around her with a love that filled her heart. "Mommy," Ethan whispered sleepily, "we're glad it's just us now." Laura's eyes softened as she kissed his forehead. "Me too," she replied, her voice a gentle promise. In that moment, she knew that everything she had done, all the pain, all the battles, had been worth it. She had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, had created a world where she and her children could thrive. Standing by the window later that night, looking out over the quiet Evanston neighborhood that had witnessed her struggle, Laura felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She no longer needed to be the perfect wife or the silent, suffering mother. She was simply herself, strong, resilient, and free. The path ahead was hers alone, and she was ready to walk it with courage and hope. For Laura, this was only the beginning. The days following Laura's first confrontation with David were filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. The house, once a place of comfort and shared memories, now felt cold and distant. David's attempts to apologize were weak at best, and his defensive stance only fueled Laura's resolve. She knew she couldn't let this betrayal go, not for herself, and certainly not for their children. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that confronting David alone wasn't enough. The truth needed to be revealed to those who mattered most, the people who had supported their marriage, the family that had trusted David, and the community that had seen their family as perfect. It was time to expose him for who he truly was. Laura began to form a plan. It had to be perfect. The family reunion, which had always been an event David looked forward to, was the ideal setting. The Sanders family reunion was a yearly tradition that everyone attended, a time for barbecues, games, and shared memories. It was a gathering where David would try to present himself as the successful, perfect husband and father. Laura knew this would be her moment to take back control, to show everyone the man he had become behind the mask he wore for so long. Laura's heart pounded as she set her plan into motion. She knew the stakes were high. If she exposed David at the reunion, there would be no going back. It would be a public humiliation, and it would destroy any semblance of respect or dignity he still held. But that, she realized, was exactly the point. He had taken everything from her, her trust, her peace of mind, her happiness, and now it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. First, Laura needed to make sure she had the evidence. She had already gathered text messages and a few pictures of David leaving the house at odd hours, but now she needed something more concrete. She set up small, discreet cameras in their home, hidden in plain sight. One camera was placed in a decorative clock on their bedroom dresser, its lens unobtrusive but clear enough to capture everything. Another was cleverly concealed inside a photo frame in the living room, positioned to catch any interactions that might unfold there. These cameras would record the truth, every moment David spent with Emma in their home, every look, every touch. In addition to the visual evidence, Laura placed a voice recorder inside David's briefcase. It was a small, nearly invisible device that would activate with sound, capturing all the intimate conversations between David and Emma. Laura knew this would be the final blow, the proof that could never be denied. As she prepared for the reunion, Laura's mind raced with the potential reactions of David's family. She knew how they had always viewed her, as the loving wife, the devoted mother. Would they believe her? Would they understand why she was doing this, or would they accuse her of breaking apart the family? These questions haunted her as she set everything in motion, but deep down, she knew she couldn't continue living in the shadows of David's lies. The final piece of her plan fell into place when she bought a small USB drive, which she filled with the compiled footage and audio she had carefully collected. She edited the clips to showcase the most damning moments, David and Emma together in their home, speaking intimately, laughing, whispering sweet promises. The sound of David's voice, tender and soft as he spoke to Emma, would be the ultimate proof of his betrayal. She reviewed the file one last time, her hands shaking as she watched the clips again. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. With the day of the reunion approaching, Laura kept her emotions in check. On the surface, she played the part of the loving wife, smiling through the day-to-day interactions with David, even as her heart raced with the knowledge of what was to come. The kids were excited for the family reunion. Lily and Ethan were oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, eager to play with their cousins and enjoy the festivities. Laura tried to keep up appearances for their sake, knowing this was not just about her own healing but about protecting them as well. The morning of the reunion arrived, and Laura felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. She wore a simple but elegant dress, nothing too flashy, but perfect for the occasion. As she and David drove to the family estate, she remained quiet, her mind focused on the task ahead. David chatted aimlessly about the event, about catching up with family, but Laura couldn't focus on his words. She was already thinking about the evening, about the moment when the truth would finally come to light. As the Sanders family reunion came into full swing, laughter and conversation filled the spacious backyard of David's parents' estate. Barbecues sizzled, children played tag across the lawn, and clusters of family members reminisced, unaware of the tension simmering beneath Laura's calm demeanor. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and polite smiles, all while clutching her purse where the USB containing her carefully compiled evidence rested. David was in his element, confidently mingling and laughing as if he were still the family man he pretended to be. His siblings, cousins, and friends gathered around him, eager to hear his stories of success and the charming anecdotes he always shared at these events. Laura watched him from across the lawn, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if she were observing a stranger rather than the man she had once loved. He seemed so comfortable, so unaware of the reality about to crash down on him. As dusk approached, David's father called everyone inside for the family's annual tradition, the slideshow. Each year, the Sanders family put together a collection of photos and videos to showcase their memories, milestones, and joyful moments over the past year. Everyone gathered in the cozy living room, settling into sofas and armchairs as they prepared to watch the slideshow that symbolized their family bond. This year, Laura had arranged for something different. With her heart pounding, she waited for the lights to dim, watching as David's father connected the laptop to the projector. She saw David smile, his eyes bright with the same pride he displayed every year as his family honored their time together. Little did he know that this year, his deception would be the focus of the room. Under the cover of dim lighting, Laura approached the laptop and, with careful precision, switched the USB drive for her own. She navigated to the folder containing her files, setting everything up as seamlessly as possible. Taking a deep breath, she pressed play and stepped back, her eyes never leaving David's face. The first image flickered onto the screen, and the room quieted as everyone focused on the projected image. But instead of family photos, a video clip began to play, grainy, but unmistakable. David's silhouette appeared, seated close to another figure, their faces partially obscured but still identifiable. Emma's laughter filled the room, the sound soft and intimate. And then, as clear as day, David's voice could be heard, speaking words that cut through the silence like a knife. "I've missed you, Emma," he murmured, his voice tender, his tone betraying a closeness that had once belonged to Laura alone. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the murmurs of shock growing louder with each passing second. David's mother covered her mouth, her eyes widening in disbelief. His siblings exchanged stunned glances, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. The family they had thought to be perfect was unraveling before them, exposed in painful, undeniable clarity. David's face drained of color as he realized what was happening. "Laura," he whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with panic. He stood up abruptly, his eyes darting toward her, but she held her ground, her expression unyielding. "Sit down, David," Laura said quietly but firmly. Her voice carried a power that stopped him in his tracks. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of control, a clarity that left her unafraid. "This is the truth that you've hidden from everyone here, the reality you tried to keep from your family." The video continued to play, clip after clip, each one capturing moments of intimacy between David and Emma that tore through the room like a hurricane. The soft touches, the shared laughter, the whispered promises, they painted a devastating picture that no one could deny. Each scene struck like a hammer blow, shattering the illusions David had so carefully crafted over the years. David's father, a man of few words and immense pride, stood up, his face set in a hard, unyielding line. "David," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight of disappointment and anger that no one had ever heard from him before. "How could you do this? To your wife? To your children? To us?" David tried to stammer a response, his words failing him as he struggled to find an explanation, a way out. I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake," he choked, his eyes darting between his parents, his siblings, and the image of Emma still lingering on the screen. "A mistake." Laura's voice cut through his excuses like ice. She stepped forward, meeting his gaze with unwavering conviction. "No, David. A mistake is something you regret, something you try to fix. But you didn't try to fix this, did you? You brought her into our home. You lied to me, to everyone in this room, thinking you'd never get caught." The weight of her words settled over the room, leaving no room for denial. David's siblings looked away, unable to meet his gaze, their expressions laced with disappointment and shame. His mother's eyes glistened with tears, her face a mask of heartbreak and betrayal. His father turned away, shaking his head in silence, the final gesture of condemnation that cut deeper than any words could. In a desperate attempt, David lunged forward, reaching for the laptop to stop the video, but Laura stepped between him and the screen. "It's over, David," she said, her voice firm and unyielding. "You can't hide from this anymore. Everyone here deserves to know the truth about who you are." David faltered, his bravado crumbling as he realized he was out of options. He sank back into his seat, his head bowed, his face ashen. The room remained silent, the only sound the faint hum of the projector as it cast the final images onto the screen. In those moments, the family who had once admired him looked at him as a stranger, a man who had betrayed everything they believed in. As the last clip faded to black, Laura took a deep breath, feeling a sense of release wash over her. She had done it. She had reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her truth. For months, she had suffered in silence, but now, surrounded by those who had once idolized David, she had laid bare the betrayal that had torn her life apart. The room remained still, each person grappling with the reality before them. And for David, there was no escape. His carefully constructed facade lay in ruins, and he sat among the wreckage, stripped of the respect and admiration he had once commanded. Laura had exposed him for who he truly was, and there would be no more lies, no more deceit. In that moment, Laura knew that she had won, not just over David, but over the pain, the betrayal, and the silence that had held her captive. She had taken back her power, her life, and her story, leaving David to face the consequences of his choices alone. In the days following the family reunion, David's life began to crumble piece by piece. The events of that evening had stripped him of every illusion, leaving his carefully maintained image shattered beyond repair. No matter how hard he tried to brush off the shame, the consequences of his betrayal were inescapable. Evanston was a small community, and word of what had transpired at the Sanders family reunion spread quickly. Neighbors whispered, friends distanced themselves, and every place David had once found comfort now seemed to close in on him. David's parents, who had always been his greatest supporters, could hardly look at him. His father's disappointment was especially difficult to bear. Throughout David's life, his father had been a figure of pride and authority, a man who held family loyalty and integrity above all else. But after witnessing the truth of David's betrayal, he had withdrawn, his silence a condemnation more powerful than any words. When David visited his parents' home in the days following the reunion, he found his father's door closed to him. The once warm presence of his family home was now as cold and unwelcoming as a stranger's house. David's mother, too, had changed. She had always been his confidant, the person he turned to in times of difficulty. But now, she seemed worn and weary, her eyes clouded with a sadness he couldn't erase. Every glance she cast in his direction was filled with disappointment, and David knew he had lost her respect. She spoke little, her words measured and distant, and when he tried to apologize, to explain, she simply shook her head, as if she no longer recognized him. His siblings, who had once been his friends as well as family, now kept their distance. James, his elder brother, who had always admired David's confidence and charm, could barely look him in the eye. Their once close bond had dissolved into silence and resentment, as James made it clear he couldn't forgive the hurt David had caused Laura and the betrayal he had inflicted on their family. His other siblings, who had once gathered around him, who had celebrated his successes, now looked at him with pity and disdain. David felt the weight of their judgment with every visit, every stilted family dinner that he was barely allowed to attend. But perhaps the hardest consequence of all was the impact on his children, Lily and Ethan. In the aftermath of the revelation, Laura had shielded them from the details, but they sensed the tension, the silence that fell over the household. Lily, once so close to her father, seemed hesitant around him, her innocent trust tainted by confusion she was too young to fully understand. Ethan's bright, boyish smile disappeared whenever David was near, and David's attempts to connect were met with wary glances and quiet avoidance. Laura, standing firm in her convictions, had ensured that David would face legal consequences as well. When the divorce proceedings began, David found himself cornered. He had little leverage, no way to argue for joint custody or a favorable division of their assets. Laura had gathered overwhelming evidence, not just of his infidelity but of his negligence as a partner and father. The court awarded her full custody of the children, and David was left with a stark reality: he would have limited visitation, carefully monitored and strictly enforced. The days of playing the role of a loving father were over, and the life he had taken for granted was no longer his to claim. Financially, David faced a blow that further deepened his descent. The court ordered him to divide his assets with Laura, leaving him to shoulder significant monthly child support payments. His once comfortable lifestyle now felt precarious, as he struggled to adjust to the harsh financial toll of his actions. His savings dwindled, and the luxury he had enjoyed for years now felt like a distant memory. His job, which had once been a source of pride and stability, became yet another place where whispers followed him, where colleagues looked at him with knowing eyes, their judgment concealed behind polite facades. David tried to seek solace in his relationship with Emma, but even that was tainted by the fallout. The excitement, the thrill that had once characterized their affair, quickly faded in the harsh light of reality. Emma, realizing the gravity of the situation, distanced herself, unwilling to be tied to a man whose life was crumbling around him. The passionate promises and whispered words they had shared felt hollow now, exposed as the fleeting illusions they were. In the end, Emma's departure left David truly alone, facing the wreckage of his choices without the support of family, friends, or even the woman he had sacrificed everything for. The isolation weighed on him, suffocating in its intensity. Every attempt to rebuild was met with reminders of his fall. His parents' house was no longer open to him, his siblings offered no forgiveness, and the few friends who hadn't turned away kept their distance, unsure how to interact with the man he had become. He tried to find solace in the familiar, in the routines that had once brought him joy, but nothing felt the same. The respect he had commanded, the admiration he had enjoyed, had vanished, replaced by a hollow silence that echoed his own shame. Each month, as he made the court-ordered payments to Laura, David felt the weight of his mistakes anew. Every transaction, every dollar that left his account was a reminder of what he had lost, of the life he had destroyed. His bitterness grew, a constant companion that gnawed at him, reminding him of the choices he couldn't undo. And so, David found himself trapped in a life of his own making, a life marked by solitude, regret, and the lingering memories of what he had once had. The facade he had carefully constructed over the years lay in ruins, a stark reminder that betrayal carried a price he hadn't anticipated. For Laura, the betrayal had been painful, but for David, the consequences were permanent. He was left with a lifetime of regret, haunted by the knowledge that the respect, love, and family he had once taken for granted were now lost to him forever. In the weeks that followed her confrontation with David and the family's painful reckoning, Laura found herself living a life she had never envisioned but had long needed. The betrayal and heartbreak had been devastating, but as each day passed, Laura began to feel lighter, her heart slowly unburdening itself from the pain and resentment she had carried for so long. She was finally free from the lies, the doubt, and the quiet suffering she had endured in silence. Now, with her life in her own hands, she was determined to rebuild it with intention, strength, and a renewed sense of purpose. One of her first steps toward independence was reclaiming her professional life. For years, Laura had put her career aspirations aside, dedicating herself wholly to her family and David's ambitions. But now, she was ready to explore what the world had to offer on her terms. She enrolled in a part-time course at a local college, studying business and community development, areas she had always been passionate about. Each class was a step toward her new life, reigniting the excitement of learning and self-improvement. Sitting among other students, taking notes, and discussing ideas made her feel alive again, reminding her of the person she had once been before her identity became bound to her marriage. Her days settled into a peaceful rhythm. She filled her mornings with study, afternoons with work she found through community connections, and evenings with the joyful sounds of her children. Lily and Ethan, now living in a household free from the unspoken tension that had filled it before, blossomed in this new chapter. Laura could see the difference in them. Lily's laughter was more frequent, her smiles brighter, while Ethan's once timid demeanor grew more confident as he saw his mother thrive. They were growing up in an environment that valued honesty and respect, and Laura was determined to be the example they needed. Weekends became a time for adventure and bonding. Laura planned outings to the park, museums, and libraries, creating new traditions with her children that filled their home with laughter and warmth. She watched as they explored their world with unfiltered curiosity, their questions endless, their joy contagious. These moments with Lily and Ethan brought Laura a sense of fulfillment deeper than she had ever known. Her life was now defined by love that was genuine, by bonds that were unbreakable. In the quiet evenings, once the children were asleep, Laura found time to reconnect with herself. She began keeping a journal, a simple ritual that allowed her to process her emotions and dreams. Writing down her thoughts, she felt a release, a way to let go of the lingering pain and make room for hope. Her journal became a canvas for her aspirations, filled with lists of places she wanted to visit, skills she wanted to learn, and projects she wanted to pursue. Each entry was a reminder that her life was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The support from her community had been unwavering, and Laura leaned into it with gratitude. Friends and neighbors who had seen her through the hardest times continued to stand by her, inviting her to gatherings, checking in on her, and providing small gestures of kindness. She reconnected with friends she hadn't seen in years, people who understood the value of independence and resilience. Slowly, her social circle grew, filling her life with companionship and laughter that had once felt lost to her. These friendships became a source of strength, reminding her that she wasn't alone and that there were people who cherished her for who she was. Financially, Laura found herself navigating a new landscape, one that required careful planning and mindful spending. The assets she'd received in the divorce provided a foundation, but she was determined to build her own financial stability. She took on a part-time role in a local nonprofit organization, where her background in community development and her compassion for others made her a natural fit. Her work not only provided for her family but also gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Each day, she found herself pouring her energy into causes she cared about, building a career that aligned with her values and gave back to the community that had supported her. For the first time in years, Laura allowed herself to dream again. She began to envision a future where she could travel, explore new interests, and create a life filled with purpose and passion. She signed up for a yoga class, finding peace and strength in the practice, and even joined a book club where she met others who shared her love of literature. Each activity, each new pursuit, felt like a piece of herself she was reclaiming. She was no longer just a mother, just a former wife. She was Laura, a woman with dreams, ambitions, and a life of her own. One evening, as she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the Evanston neighborhood in warm hues, Laura felt a deep, quiet contentment. Her life was no longer defined by David's choices or the pain he had caused her. She had risen above it, stronger and more whole than she had ever been. Her journey was no longer one of survival but of discovery, a path that led her toward new experiences, new people, and new possibilities. In that moment, Laura knew that she had reclaimed her story. She was the author of her own life, and her story was one of resilience, growth, and unshakable strength. The love she shared with her children, the friendships she nurtured, and the life she was building were hers alone. She had learned to stand on her own, to find peace in her solitude, and to embrace the unknown with courage. The future, once overshadowed by heartbreak and betrayal, now lay open before her, filled with endless possibilities. And as she looked forward, she did so with the quiet confidence of a woman who had not only survived but had thrived. Laura had found her voice, her strength, and her freedom, and she knew that whatever lay ahead, she was ready. As the months passed, Laura embraced a life defined by purpose and authenticity, a life free from the burdens of secrecy and betrayal. Each day was a step further into the future she was building for herself and her children, a future marked by resilience, honesty, and an unwavering commitment to self-respect. With each passing week, the memories of her past with David faded, replaced by new experiences, new connections, and a deep sense of inner peace that Laura had never known before. One evening, Laura received a message from her old college friend, Sarah, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. They had been close once, sharing dreams of travel, career goals, and endless possibilities before life had taken them on different paths. Sarah had heard about Laura's recent journey and extended an invitation to visit her in Seattle, where she had recently moved. For a moment, Laura hesitated, the familiar worry about leaving home and the children surfacing. But this time, she quickly silenced her doubts. She knew that her life didn't have to revolve solely around the roles of mother and caregiver. She was also a woman with her own dreams. She arranged for her parents to look after Lily and Ethan, assured them that this short trip would be a chance for her to reconnect with old friends and rediscover parts of herself. For the first time in years, she boarded a plane alone, feeling the rush of excitement and independence. The feeling of freedom and possibility filled her, reminding her of the person she had been before the years of responsibility and sacrifice. The trip, a small but significant step, allowed her to embrace the simple joy of living for herself, of finding fulfillment that was hers alone. Upon returning, Laura felt a renewed energy and focus. The trip had given her perspective, a reminder that she could be both a mother and a woman with her own dreams, that she could pursue happiness without guilt. Her children, too, seemed to sense this change. They welcomed her back with wide smiles and excited stories of their time with their grandparents, and Laura could feel the connection between them growing stronger with each new day. She saw in their eyes a reflection of her own strength, a strength they had learned from watching her rise above heartbreak and stand tall in the face of adversity. Laura's career at the nonprofit began to flourish, and her involvement in the community became a source of pride. Her work helped her rediscover her passion for advocacy, a cause she had always held close to her heart. She organized events, developed programs, and worked closely with local families, finding fulfillment in supporting others who were rebuilding their lives just as she had. Her contributions did not go unnoticed, and soon, Laura was approached with an offer for a full-time leadership role within the organization. The position came with new responsibilities, but it was an opportunity she embraced wholeheartedly. This was the life she had been working toward, a life where she could make a difference, lead with purpose, and create a legacy for her children. At home, Laura continued to build a nurturing, positive environment for Lily and Ethan. She encouraged their interests, cheered on their successes, and supported them through challenges. Together, they created new family traditions, weekend picnics, movie nights, and baking sessions that filled their home with laughter and joy. Laura saw how resilient they were, how the strength she had found within herself had empowered them as well. They were thriving, surrounded by love and stability, and Laura knew that they would grow up understanding the importance of integrity, respect, and self-worth. One Saturday, Laura took Lily and Ethan to the park, a familiar place where they often spent sunny afternoons. As she watched them play, her heart swelled with gratitude for the life they had together, a life that was whole, peaceful, and filled with promise. She felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond any career or financial success. It was the satisfaction of knowing she had reclaimed her life, that she had built a foundation for herself and her children that would support them for years to come. When she returned home that evening, Laura sat down with her journal, a ritual she had continued to keep. She wrote about her hopes, her dreams, her gratitude for the journey she had taken. Each page was filled with memories, lessons, and dreams for the future. As she read over her entries, she saw her transformation reflected back at her, a journey from heartbreak to empowerment, from silence to self-expression, from dependence to independence. For Laura, the journey had been painful and challenging, but it had also been deeply transformative. She had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live a life rooted in authenticity and resilience. Her story was no longer one of betrayal but of self-discovery and triumph. She had not only found herself, she had created a future that was rich with purpose and possibility. That night, as she lay in bed, she closed her eyes, feeling a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges, but she knew that she had the strength to face them, that she was equipped with the resilience to overcome whatever came her way. Her life was her own, and the woman she had become was one she could finally love, respect, and be proud of. For the first time in years, Laura fell asleep with a heart unburdened, her mind at ease. The scars of the past had not disappeared, but they had healed, becoming a testament to her strength and the journey she had taken. As she drifted into sleep, she knew that the life she had reclaimed was hers to keep, filled with boundless potential, love, and the quiet joy of knowing that she had found herself again. And in that peace, Laura embraced the future, a future she would face with courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that she had, at long last, become the woman she was always meant to be.